Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. As G7 leaders meet in Alberta, the summit is shaping discussions around some of the world's most urgent challenges, from the tension to the Middle East to the support for Ukraine and strategic competition to economic resilience and global cooperation. With outcomes and diplomatic signals emerging, what should observers pay closest attention to? Joining us on a timely perspective is Balkan Devlen, co-founder of Pendulum Geopolitical Advisory and a leading expert in foreign policy, security strategy, and transatlantic affairs. Hello, sir, and welcome to TVP World.
Thanks for having me.
So as the summit is unfolding, what are some of the key outcomes, messages should we be keeping an eye out for as from the G7 leaders?
From the Canadian side, I think the primary objective is not to have a blowout like it did in 2018 when Canada hosted the summit last time, and there was no communiqué after Donald Trump left the summit. So primarily, if there is no upset, there is no a crisis or a scandal or a blowout, we would consider that to be a success. The second thing I think we need to be watching out for is not so much the agenda itself in G7, but what sort of bilateral side meetings are going to take place. Because in addition to the 7 countries plus the European Union as the usual members of the club, Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, invited about 15 other countries, plus a number of international organizations such as IMF and the World Bank to the summit. So it is a larger international gathering at a time when we have a fresh war going on in the Middle East, and of course Russia's invasion of Ukraine stepping up. So it will be a number of opportunities for side meetings to occur, and a lot of those we'll be watching out.
All right, like you mentioned, perhaps this is one of those instances where the meetings on the sideline, kind of behind closed door discussions, is just as important, if not more important than what we are seeing on the front stage of things. With the Trump again stepping into the presidential office, do you think that his relation with the G7 leaders is going to cause some tension going forward?
It might. I mean, I think most of the world leaders learned from not only from the first term of President Trump's administration, but since January, how to deal with the Trump administration. And I think 2 things are clear, and this is being recognized by different world leaders. Number one, Donald Trump doesn't really do multilateralism. He prefers to deal in bilateral relationships, and therefore, if he feels like other countries are ganging up on him, he might react badly. So I would expect not to see that and being cornered. The second one is that I think this is true for NATO Secretary General. This is true for various prime ministers. It is important for Donald Trump to have the perception that he's the one who is leading and he has some wins. And I think world leaders from President Zelensky to Starmer to Carney to others recognize that. So they might try to frame some of the communiques or joint statements coming out of this summit as giving credit to Donald Trump on certain issues, including defense and several other issues, and that might actually smoothen the way, because as we all know, not every leader has a particularly good relationship with Donald Trump. President Macron is an example. He's not necessarily getting along extremely well with von der Leyen and others, etc. So we'll see how that would shape up. But I think world leaders learn in a way how to deal with and communicate with President Trump, and we'll see. This will be a good test of that when they all gathered here in Kannassas in Alberta.
Right, and as the Middle East, of course, is embroiled in tension once again, and of course, there's also international relations that needs to be addressed. Do you think that the topic of Ukraine might kind of be more sidelined in this time around?
It might be, but it's very important for Canada, and of course it is very important for other members of G7. President Zelensky will be taking part in the summit. In terms of concrete deliverables coming out. I'm not particularly optimistic about anything that would actually push the envelope. I would assume there will be some language coming out when it comes to continuing support for Ukraine. And I would expect some language coming out, perhaps, if we're lucky enough to have lowered thresholds, price cap for Russian oil, for example, and a commitment to keep Russian central bank assets frozen, because a significant portion of them are held in euros, as you know, in Euroclear, and those sanctions are coming up for renewal in July. So I would expect some level of commitment, at least to continue to keep them frozen. But apart from that, I'm not particularly sure there will be any groundbreaking announcements coming from G7. Partly because I don't expect to have a joint communiqué being published as a result. We might have a number of joint statements from different partners and countries, but I'm not sure we'll have a joint communiqué as a group at the end this year.
Right, and like you mentioned, Mark Carney actually invited a lot of world leaders. This is called the G7 Summit, but it is not just that. There's a lot of participants as well. But we also do understand that a lot of these world leaders have different stances when it comes to be it the war in Ukraine or the situation in the Middle East. So does it seem like this discrepancy is going to throw a wrench in having a unified message? And how do you think they will be going about kind of bridging that gap?
That's why I think we might see some joint statements with the like-minded states, Canada joining its European allies, for example, when it comes to reaffirming its support for Ukraine, and perhaps reaffirming its support when it comes to continuing the freezing of Russian central bank assets. It's important to note that about 9% of those Russian central bank assets are in Canadian dollars. There is about 22 billion Canadian dollars worth of assets that actually the Canadian government can act if it chooses to do so. So I think it is important to continue to bring that up as much as possible on the table and make sure that those assets don't go back to Russia. But as you pointed out, given the presence of other countries such as Brazil and India and South Africa, I am not expecting everybody joining a particular communique that supports a very strong support show for Ukraine in this case. We might see separate individual joint statements from like-minded states, but not a joint communique that takes place that every country that took part will sign on to.
And speaking of like-minded state, I'm also curious of whether or not the Canada, the European Union countries, they will be able to sustain the same sort of unity when it comes to its rhetoric with Trump in presence. Do you think that there's a chance in the pursuit of their own national interest, the discussion might come out a bit differently than what's to be expected?
That is possible. For example, it is on one of the things that will be talked a lot on the sidelines, but not on the agenda, will be trade and tariffs. For example, the Mexican president will be coming to the summit, so we might see some announcement coming out of Canada, U.S. and Mexico, for example, for an early start of renegotiating or renewal of the USMCA. The free trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. So that might be a good deliverable if that comes out. And every other country, I presume, would like to pursue different bilateral conversations with Donald Trump, and that might lead to different choices by countries. One of the reasons why I don't think we would have a communique and a joint declaration is precisely each country might be pursuing different national interests in this regard, and that's the way Donald Trump prefers to deal with, as I pointed out, a bilateral relations one-on-one rather than dealing with them as a group.
And as a foreign policy expert, which countries will you be personally paying attention to? Which bilateral meetings or sideline engagement you think might carry outsized importance coming out of the gathering? I mean, we know Trump-Zelensky is going to be a big one, and like you previously mentioned, perhaps Mexico's involvement. Anything else we should be keeping a close eye on?
Apart from those two, at least from the Canadian side, I think it is important to see whether the announced meeting between Prime Minister Carney and Prime Minister Modi of India will deliver certain outcomes. The relations have been in the tank in the past couple of years between Canada and India, and this is an important step to repair those relationships. So at least in Canada, we'll be paying closer attention to that particular meeting. What we probably would like to also see coming out of this on the Canadian side again is when we talk with our European partners and allies, especially when it comes to critical minerals and supply chains, as well as defense spending and defense industry, whether there will be some concrete deliverable when it comes to Canada taking part in the rearming of Europe and defense industrial cooperation. So that I think will be an important point to watch out for as well.
Right. So last but not least, going back to what you mentioned in the beginning, do you think that the lawmakers, public, can evaluate whether this summit moved the dial on global cooperation purely by the fact that they're able to come out with any sort of joint statement in this very turbulent geopolitical times?
Perhaps. I mean, as I pointed out, I am not particularly optimistic about a joint communiqué coming out of it, but there will be individual joint statements. We might end up having one that everyone maybe signs up on, and that is on wildfires. This is kind of the first time this issue is coming up on a G7, and it is if you can avoid explicitly linking it to climate change, we might end up having some sort of a joint statement that everyone signs on to. No one is pro wildfires, so we might be able to get something out of that. But for the rest, I am not particularly optimistic that things that will be coming out will be pushing the dial. If we don't take step backs as a result of some sort of a blow up in the summit, I would count that as a win.
All right, so hopefully they will have something to unify behind, and be it wildfire or whatnot. But thank you so much for your input and insight. I really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on TVP World.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers. And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.